chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. We'll be there in just a moment. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Before we get started in chapter 8, we do want to remind ourselves of the outline we're following in the book of 1 Corinthians. And then, after we look at the outline of 1 Corinthians, we'll get into chapter 8 and sort of lay the background for the next 3 chapters, actually, as they are a unit of chapters that go together in 8, 9, and 10. The book of 1 Corinthians is about contentions among you. And the book divides itself down into 4 major sections. The first of those is some problems that Paul had learned by report. The problem of divisions in 1 through 4. Some are divided. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, and I am of Christ. And there's this division taking place in 1 through 4. Chapter 5 and chapter 6 deal with the fact that there's some problems concerning fornication, particularly chapter 5, fornication among them. Chapter 6 talks about avoiding fornication. Chapter 5, we have to deal with discipline, or in reality, the lack thereof, of the church of Corinth, not exercising discipline. Chapter 6, the problem of litigation. They were going to law against one another. We're in section 2 right now. This spans chapter 7 through 14. Questions the Corinthians asked Paul. Chapter 7 that we saw in our last couple of studies is about questions they had about marriage. Chapter 8 through 10 is meat sacrificed to idols. Chapter 11 is about the covering and headship and abuse of the Lord's Supper. And chapters 12 through 14, questions about spiritual gifts. Chapter 15 then is false teaching on the resurrection, and chapter 16 is the collection and salutations. We're ready for chapter 8 now. Again, we're in that second main section, and we're ready for the second subsection about eating meat sacrificed to idols. That's what chapter 8 deals with. I'll try to get the outline out here by Sunday morning for chapter 9, but chapter 9 is going to continue that thought and pick up where Paul's going to lead off in verse 13. And that thought runs through not chapter 10, but actually chapter 11 and in verse 1. And so when we get to chapter 10, we'll actually take the first verse of chapter 11 and study it in chapter 10 as it goes back to the previous section. But these next 3 chapters and the first verse of chapter 11 are all dealing with this eating of meat sacrificed to idols and liberties. So chapter 8 is going to deal with the specifics of eating meat. Chapter 9 is going to deal with Paul being an example of one who was willing to give up liberties for the sake of his brethren. And chapter 10 is a warning about the example of Israel and to take heed lest they fall, because some of them were being lifted up with pride, which we'll see here in chapter 8. Before we get into chapter 8 itself, I want to note a couple of things here about chapter 8. Sometimes there's a question that gets asked about this chapter and a comment made in Acts chapter 15, and then the question that gets raised is, do these contradict? Here's why. Look at verse 28 and 29 of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It says in the English Standard Version, "For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these requirements, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you do well. Farewell." And so, in Acts chapter 15, 28 and 29, they were told to abstain from things sacrificed to idols. Yet in 8, 9, and 10, and we're going to have to get a little bit ahead as we lay the background of this, but I want to deal with this question before we get into this chapter itself, is the question comes to this contradiction, because then he's talking about those who can eat, and he's not talking about if there's anything wrong. In fact, he's dealing with, as we mentioned already, liberties, right? You can or cannot eat. It's up to you. It's not a matter of right or wrong. Well, hang on. Acts 15 said don't eat those things. Let's lay a little bit of background work for Acts 15 versus 1 Corinthians 10 to show these don't contradict. So, again, the question, do they contradict? No, they don't. I want to hit a couple of things that I think help explain this. Number one, we're talking about meat that is offered in the marketplace. Look at 1 Corinthians 10:25. Again, we're going to have to jump a little bit ahead for a moment, but this helps us lay the background work before we get into this chapter. In 1 Corinthians 10:25 it says, "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any questions on the ground of conscience." So, here's the background. In cities like Corinth, in a lot of places, you would have your temples for these idols. And sometimes there were meat that were offered in that then in turn would be taken and sold in the meat market. It may not have been offered to an idol, but it might have been offered to an idol. You don't know. The only way in which you might know is if you were to ask and the person selling it knew the answer. So what he's dealing with here is there are some that are abstaining from eating altogether the meats, lest it have been sacrificed to an idol. And some say we can eat that meat. We don't know if it was or not. There's nothing wrong with the meat itself. We can eat that. This is not the same thing as eating in the temple of the idols. 1 Corinthians 8:10, we'll get to this in just a moment, where there's a statement that's made about it in there. I think it's another example of Paul being somewhat sarcastic in his response given to them about eating the meat there. But the indication is, in these chapters, you don't go to the temple and eat the meat. We're talking about that which is bought in the marketplace. Also in Acts chapter 15, notice that in Acts 15 and 19 through 21 it says, "Therefore my judgment," this is James after he's finished his speech, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, and by sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled and from blood. Far from ancient generations, Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues." Now, if you recall, when we were back in Acts chapter 15, we pointed out there, you've got Jews and Gentiles who have completely different backgrounds. And they're coming together. The Jews, they may have some trouble eating meats. We know that from Romans 14. More about that in a second. And then the Gentiles may be eating meats that were from the marketplace that may have once been sacrificed to idols. What Acts 15 is saying is, you abstain from this in order to make that relationship better between the Jews and the Gentiles. I think that's the indication by James' response about the law being taught. There's just going to be a hindrance if you're eating these things. So what you need to do is get rid of anything that has association with idolatry. That's going to become a problem in the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. As on the other hand, as we mentioned already, 1 Corinthians 10:25 is bought in the marketplace in eating without raising questions. And so we're talking about that which is bought in the marketplace. And Lord willing, when we get to chapter 10, we'll see that brought up again. But I want to lay a little bit of that background work, because that question gets asked sometimes. Why does it seem different from Acts 15? Why does it seem to be a contradiction? That's the answer as to why these things are very different. We're dealing with meat sacrificed to idols, but from two different standpoints in both texts. Now, a couple other things we want to know before we get into the text. 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, this entire unit of chapters. There's a few units of chapters, if you will. We saw one in 1 through 4. We see one here in 8 through 10. And we'll see one in 12 through 14. They're all units of chapters. Those chapters go together. And so they're dealing with one thought. 1 through 4, the divisions. 8 through 10, the eating meats. And then 12 through 14, spiritual gifts. That's a unit of chapters that goes together. In this unit of chapters, we're dealing with issues that are matters of liberties. It's not a matter of here's something that's right and here's something that's wrong. It's a matter of one feels they can buy the meat in the marketplace and eat it, and the other feels they cannot. Sounds familiar? It sounds an awful lot like the issue of Romans chapter 14. Both have to do with eating of meats. It's a different eating of meats. Romans 14 is Jews who couldn't eat meats that were prohibited under the old law, but now they could eat them. They didn't feel comfortable eating those. Some did, some didn't. This chapter, some felt comfortable buying meat in the marketplace and eating it, not knowing whether to sacrifice or not. Others abstained from meat altogether because of that. Two different eating of meats, both come back to a matter of liberties and respect and love for your brethren, as for the choice not to cause them to stumble. So the points are different, and yet at the same time, they're the same. We're both dealing with liberties, though it's two different eating of meats. And so, as we go through these three chapters and see that, we're dealing with this issue of liberties. Now, chapter 8, beginning at verse 1 and going through verse 8, Paul says, "Not all have the knowledge that an idol is nothing." Let's begin at verses 1 through 3, where he says, "Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. Now, concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God." So I want to notice a phrase here that occurs in verse 1. And that is, in verse 1, he says, "This knowledge," and we'll come back about this knowledge in a minute, but this knowledge puffs up. Now he began by defining to them that all possess knowledge. Now, will somebody read verse 7 for us? He said, verse 1, all possess knowledge. Will somebody read for us verse 7, please?
Howbeit there is not in every man knowledge. For some was conscious of the idol under this hour, eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled.
Okay, so verse 1, all possess knowledge. Verse 7, not all possess knowledge. It seems they have the attitude that all of them have this knowledge, and so it's not a big deal. And Paul's pointing out, listen, you think everybody possesses knowledge, but not all possess knowledge. And the problem with some of their knowledge was it was more than what they needed. We'll see that in a minute when we get to verse 10. I think that's the indication in verse 10. Their knowledge that they thought they had, they were going beyond what they could go. In fact, their knowledge they thought they had, according to verse 1, was puffed up. They're arrogant. So looking at verse 1, this knowledge puffs up. So I think verse 1 is he pointing out, we all possess knowledge. He's not saying literally we all have the knowledge. Now they do all know an idol is nothing, but some don't possess that knowledge when it comes to what? Eating of meats. Right? That's been offered. Imagine being a Gentile who grew up worshiping idols. You would go to the sacrifice of these meats and eat this meat sacrificed to idols. And you know sometimes it's put in the marketplace. Now you go to the marketplace and you've grown up worshiping that idol that might have been sacrificed to. And you know that idol is nothing. But in your mind, eating that meat, you might associate it with idol worship. And that's the problem some of them have. Well, there's this knowledge. All of us possess knowledge. By the way, in the English Standard Version, again, as we talked about some things in chapter 6, it's in quotation marks. Quote, all of us possess knowledge, end quote. This, quote, knowledge, that's what puffs up. Now, I want to talk about this phrase puffs up or arrogant for a minute. This knowledge puffs up. It's interesting, this specific Greek word, now other forms of it are found numerous times in the Scriptures, but this specific Greek word is only found 7 times in the New Testament. 6 of those 7 times occur in 1 Corinthians. We've already seen it, most of those. We're going to review those real quick. But I want to point it out here in chapter 8 because I think it helps us in understanding something. So 6 of the 7 times that it occurs is in this book. The only exception to that in Colossians 2:18, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism, worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. So that's the only other occurrence outside of the book of 1 Corinthians. So where does it occur? Well, it occurs 3 of those 6 times in chapter 4. So put a marker in chapter 8, keep a finger at chapter 8, but let's go real quick to chapter 4 and just see its use already in the book. We're building up on what this puffed up is. Verse 6. I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. Some will say, well, I learned from Paul. Some will say, I learned from Apollos, so on and so forth. And they were becoming puffed up by who they had claimed they were following. Go to verse 18 now. Some are arrogant. Your translation may say puffed up. It's the same word again. Verse 19, but I will come to you soon, if the Lord wills, and I will find out not the talk of these arrogant. Same word, but their power. It occurs then in chapter 5 and in verse 2. You remember the fornicator? They hadn't dealt with him. Remember in chapter 5? And in verse 2, he says, and you are arrogant, or you are puffed up. Same Greek word again. And then it occurs in our text in 8:1. Now, if you're counting there, you're saying, well, that's only 5. I'm going to get to the 6th one in a minute. But I think we'll stop here for a second and come to that 6th occurrence in a minute. Verse 1 then, this knowledge pops up. You begin to notice a trend and a problem with the people at Corinth when it comes to any issue, really. And their problem is they think they have such great knowledge that puffs up. And so in 1 through 4, they were treating preachers more like philosophers. Who did they like? Who did they prefer? The problem is they were listening to them, and in turn they were becoming puffed up. Chapter 5, they're not withdrawing from those that are disorderly. Instead, they seem to be hanging their hat on, you see who's with us. Perhaps they were because of their tolerance of sin. Perhaps this person was in great standing. There's some debate. But whatever it was, there was some arrogance on their part. Look, about the accepting of this individual. They thought they had knowledge, but instead they had become, their quote knowledge, by that quote knowledge they had become puffed up. Chapter 8 and verse 1. They know an idol is nothing, at least some of them do. But at least two, just a quick note, verse 10, that it seems some of them were going into the temple and were saying, listen, an idol is nothing. In fact, I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to go to the temple and eat and prove to you that idol is nothing. I think that's the indication for verse 10. We'll talk more about that in a second. Their attitude was they were arrogant or puffed up by what they thought their knowledge and strength was. That's a problem that is with the church of Corinth. But in this text and in the last occurrence, the solution to being puffed up is given. Look at verse 1 again. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up or edifies. They're becoming puffed up, and by their arrogance, they're actually putting down their brethren, right? That they know more and they can eat it, and they're putting others down that can't eat. The solution is, instead of having knowledge that puffs up, you should have love that instead builds up. Who's it build up? It's going to build up the other. This gets us to our last occurrence. We haven't been there yet. It's still several chapters away, but chapter 13. Chapter 13. You know the chapter well. It's known as the great chapter on what topic? 1 Corinthians 13 is the great chapter on love. Verse 4. Love is patient. Love is kind. Here's what love is not. Love is and is not. It is patient and kind. It does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or, our word again, puffed up. And so the solution is love. Love is not arrogant or puffed up. Their problem was they lacked love in their relationship to one another, and instead were focused more on self than they were focused on their brethren. That's the problem that we have going on here. Now, verse 1 and 2. Again, concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Again, that's a quotation in the ESV, and that seems to be their attitude. They think they possess knowledge, and this knowledge they think they have is cause them to become puffed up or arrogant. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. They think they know. They think they know an awful lot. He does not yet know as he ought to know. He doesn't know as much as he thinks he does, nor does he know what he ought to know. Again, I think that attitude is reflected later on in the chapter, where their attitude seemed to be, we're going into the temple to eat, instead of just buying in the marketplace. Verse 3, but if anyone loves God, if anyone possesses love, and he possesses for his fellow man, and he possesses for God, if anyone loves God, he is what? Known by God. They thought they knew an awful lot, and they became puffed up. And what's pointed out is it's better to be known by God than to think you know a lot. They were putting their hat on what they thought their wisdom was. And instead, he points out, they should be focused on loving God and their fellow man. And if they love God, they're known by God. That's more important than all the facts they think they know. And so they're becoming lifted up. Their attitude is they're becoming puffed up or arrogant by the things they think they know. Verse 4 now. We know idols are nothing. Therefore, as the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven and on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, for whom are all things, and through whom we exist.
What chapter are you in?
Chapter 8.
Thank you.
Chapter 8, we're verse 4. So, coming into this text, if your translation differs, by the way, it may say the same thing, but quotation marks will differ. One of the things I like about the English Standard, I think they capture well the use of the quotation marks in the original. So, for example, the New King James, there's no quotation marks from 4 through 6. It's just one large statement. But in the English Standard Version, he reflects what are the so-called gods. They're not gods, right? The idols, they're not gods. but they are by man called gods. There are many gods and many lords. Those again are in quotation marks. Yet for us there is one God. Verse 6, none of it's in quotation marks. There's one God, that's the fact. Right? There may be so many, quote, gods, but in reality there is one God. And that's what he points out. He said in verse 6, therefore as to the eating of food offered to idols. Well, what's an idol? According to verse 5, it's a so-called God. We know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one. That too is in quotation marks. So there's two standpoints. Paul's just making a statement. An idol has no real existence and there is no God but one. Or perhaps it's their viewpoint, which is true, right? An idol has no real existence and there is no God but one. But it seems as perhaps they are assuming everybody else is exactly where they are spiritually. I can eat the meat. I know an idol's not real, so it doesn't bother me to go to the marketplace and buy the meat to eat. And they know that the idol's not real because they're serving the one true God, so it shouldn't bother them. So it's a true statement, but if it is as the ESV puts it in quotation marks, it seems perhaps that's their attitude, and they're thinking that they're assuming that other people know that same, are aware of that fact to the point that they should do what they do. Right? You may have a brother in Christ who knows an idol's nothing, but he grew up worshiping idols, and so for him to go eat that meat, he may associate that still with worshiping that idol, right? We mentioned that earlier. And it seems that some of the brethren at Corinth's attitude is, well, listen, I know an idol's nothing, and you're worshiping the true God, so clearly you know an idol's nothing, so it shouldn't bother you what I do. Again, it came back to a lack of love. Their attitude seemed to be, I'll do what I want to do, regardless of how you may feel about it. Now, verse 7 and 8. Come back to the statement. We read verse 1, all have knowledge. Then I brought it here for us a moment ago, verse 7, not all have knowledge. However, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Food will not commend us to God, for we are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. So the point he's making here in 7 and 8 is, not all possess this knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean they think the idol is real. Because they're still here as brethren, they're still worshiping the true God. But again, if you grew up worshiping an idol and eating that meat sacrifice and you associated that with worship to that idol, now if you go to eat that meat, what might cross your mind? I'm worshiping that idol. They may know the fact that God is one and these idols aren't real. But in their mind, they still can't help but associate that with idol worship. And so, their conscience being weak is defiled. And he points out in verse 8, food will not commend us to God, for we are no worse off if we do not eat, and we're no better off if we do. So, it seems some of them have the attitude, and I think, again, similar to Romans chapter 14, some of them seem to have the attitude that I have the right to do this, and so because I can do this, I'm going to do this, regardless of how it makes my brethren feel. And so there are some who could eat that meat. Is there anything wrong with eating the meat? No. But there were some who couldn't eat the meat. For them, is there something wrong with eating the meat? Well, yes, Romans will point that out. Right? We saw that Sunday night about the conscience, and if the conscience is defiled, Romans 14, in our lesson on Sunday evening. So when their conscience is violated, it is sin. And so some of them have the attitude that because I can eat it, I'm going to eat it, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it offends you. Even if it causes a problem for you, they seem to possess the attitude, I'm going to eat it. And Paul points out in verse 8, eating that does not commend us to God. It's not like, well, great, you had a strong enough conscience that you can eat that meat, and as if it's going to make a huge difference, right? It commends you. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. Unless, of course, it violates your conscience. But we're talking about for those that are strong enough in conscience they could eat it. They're saying, well, I'm going to eat this even though it makes brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so uncomfortable. And Paul's saying, listen, when you eat it, it doesn't make you any better off. When you don't eat it, it doesn't make you any worse off. So, when it comes to the fact that it violates that brother or sister's conscience, you should not eat it, at least around them. You want to eat it in the privacy of your own home, that's different, but don't serve it to them when they come. Well, that brings us then to the second section, that liberty can become a stumbling block. So let's back up again here. What are we dealing with? Eating of meats sacrificed to idols. Not in the temple. We're going to come to that in a moment. But we're dealing with those that, according to chapter 10 and verse 25, are sold in the meat market. So again, it's offered. It may not be offered. We don't know. And he said, don't ask questions. It could or could not have been offered in sacrifice to an idol. Now you say, I can eat that. I can go down to the meat market and buy it. May or may not have been, I don't know. I'm going to buy that question, I'm going to buy the meat, and I'm going to go home and I can eat it. You have a right to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. Somebody else says, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I associate that with idol worship because it could have been. It's not a matter of right or wrong. Again, verse 8. If you eat the meat, are you condemned as long as you feel you can eat it here? It's not a matter of right or wrong. So if you eat it, there's nothing wrong with it. Unless you violate your conscience. If you don't eat it, is there something wrong with that? Well, no. So, what are we dealing with? It's a matter of, as we said in Romans 14, an indifference to God. It's not a matter of right or wrong, it's a matter of indifference to God. That becomes a matter not of right or wrong, but a matter of liberty. But liberty can become a stumbling block. Look at verse 9 and 10. But take care that this right of yours, or this liberty of yours, does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? I think the point is, well, first verse 9, take care of this right of yours, this liberty doesn't become a stumbling block. So, can you eat this meat? Yes. You have brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so that don't feel comfortable. You know what you shouldn't do? Put the meat on the table before them. Right? That's what you shouldn't do that. Why does that become? It becomes a stumbling block. Well, verse 10 then says, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? I don't think Paul's saying you should go there. Right? Paul's not saying go to the temple. In fact, going to the temple of the idol would be saying, I am approving of this worship. Rather, I think it seems that some of them, by their, quote, knowledge, have become so puffed up that perhaps their attitude is, you know what? I have the right to eat this. You shouldn't feel weak. You shouldn't feel like you can't eat it. In fact, let me show it to you. And then they go to the temple and eat it. They go to the idol's temple, they eat it there in the temple. Doesn't mean they can't do that, but his point is, if you think you can go there and you say, I'm so strong, I'm going to the idol's temple, and now you encourage your brother to eat, but his conscience is weak, and he eats the food offered to idols, the problem is, verse 11, this weak person is destroyed. So you have a right to eat this meat. Again, verse 10 is not saying, oh, you can actually go into the temple. Right? I think his point is that you think you can go into the temple and let, yeah, here's a brother that can't eat it. Period. And you may encourage him, verse 11, listen to verse 11, and so by your knowledge. Let's go back to verse 1. Knowledge puffs up. So that's why in verse 10, where he's saying, you're in the temple and now you've encouraged them and they're eating, it seems more, is not, well, you have a right to go to the temple and eat it. In fact, he said later on that they were to get it from the meat market. And then just ask no questions. If you're not asking questions, if you go to the temple and eat it, you already know what it was used for. But that they've become so puffed up by their knowledge, they're saying, well, listen, I can do this, I can go to the temple and eat it, and it doesn't bother me because I know that idol's nothing at all. So I'll go there, I'll eat it, I know there's not really anything to it in that worship because it's not a real thing. And they do so, in verse 11, by their knowledge, this person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Yes?
I think, of course, we all know in Acts chapter 10 where Peter saw the net let down, he said, rise, kill, and eat. He said, not so, Lord. I never eaten anything. A calmer and claimed it happened 3 times. But I was looking there, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, in Mark chapter 7, verse 18 says, and he's kind of scolding the 12, I guess. He said, are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from the outside cannot defile him? because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated. And then this verse says, thus purifying all food. So I don't know if Jesus was leading in there, and I don't know that all versions contain that because there's an asterisk beside it. But it said, thus purifying all foods. And I don't know that that connects to that, but I thought about that as we're studying what we are right now, that Jesus already said the things that enter in. Of course, I know the old law was still in effect until, the day of Pentecost, but I just thought that it was interesting that it said that he thus purified all foods. And then later on, he talked about things coming from the heart in that same context there. He said one of those things is pride. So I don't think it's totally disconnected. If you look what Paul wrote to the church of Corinth, those people were prideful or puffed up and they were doing these things. But in reality, Jesus said he thus purified all foods. And we know certainly the time the church of Corinth received this, I guess Peter would have already had the vision, from the net, that down from heaven. That had never jumped out at me before about thus purifying all foods, about the defilements not coming from unwashed hands or whatever. Just something I thought about.
You're right, and perhaps it is an illusion. I do know that at least the specifics of the context definitely has to do with the washing of hands, and it being pure, even though they had washed their hands. But you're right, perhaps that is an illusion to the fact that they could later eat all things when that law was taken out of the way. But yeah, there's a problem, you pointed there, that with pride, which is the problem here at Corinth. Their pride, they think, well, I can eat this and it doesn't bother me, so it ought not bother you. And he said in verse 11, or verse 9, it can become a stumbling block. In verse 11, their knowledge, again, the knowledge puffs up, the weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died, thus sinning against your brother, and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. So a couple of important things here. First of all, by their knowledge, again, this knowledge that puffs up, they have actually destroyed their brother. How did they do that? Go back to verse 10. They're in the temple eating. Oh, listen, I know the idol's nothing, and there's nothing to this, so I'm here and I'm eating and all this. And they're eating in the temple. And now their brother sees that. Perhaps they see him go in, perhaps they see them come out, whatever it is, and they have to do it. I'm going to eat in the temple. And now they're saying, because an idol's nothing. We know an idol's nothing. There's only one God. And then this one may feel like, okay, you know what? I can eat the meat in the marketplace. But they really can't. Their conscience is still weak. They go and they eat that. Now their conscience is defiled. And they're defiled. And they're now destroyed. Why? Because it wasn't from faith. Their conscience was weak. Romans 14 would point that out. When it's a violation of one's conscience, then it is sin. Now they're destroyed. Not just are they destroyed, it's important to understand that's not just anybody, that's the brother for whom Christ died. And we know ultimately he died for everyone, but that's the brother for whom Christ died, who has obeyed the gospel, and now here you are, the one for whom Christ died, and you're destroying them because you think you have such great knowledge that you're going and doing these things out of arrogance that ought not to be done. Yes?
I think a lesson there that we all need to learn, be aware of, the danger and the power of peer pressure and influence over other people. It can be spiritually damning. We can, and you think, well, look at Peter. He preached the first gospel sermon to the first non-circumcised Gentile, obviously being Cornelius. But later Paul had to withstand him to the face. It wasn't just him, it was the other Jews. And it said even Barnabas was carried away with his stimulation or hypocrisy, we might say. So I guess I'm looking at the power of influence and how Peter was a hypocrite in that matter, and I guess because he was perceived to be a pillar, I believe the context says in Galatians, chapter 2, and that influence had. So it's true today too. It could have been this Corinth thing here. Maybe somebody wouldn't have done it, a weaker brother, but maybe this person is perceived to be stronger or knowledgeable, whatever, might have influenced this peer pressure. Well, I'm putting every bite in my mouth, it's violating my conscience, so I'm thus sinning. So I guess we just always got to remember that no man lives to himself, no man dies to himself. We affect other people.
You're right. No, that's exactly what they did in destroying the one in verse 11. Verse 12. So we can spend. Let's hit verse 12 real quick, so we can spend just a second and 13 before our time gets away from us. Verse 12. Thus sinning against your brother and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Here's something important to understand. When I sin against my brother, even in a matter of this, where it's a wounding of his conscience, it's not just a sin against my brother; it's a sin against Christ. Or Jesus, right? Jesus Christ here in verse 12. So by doing so, we sin against not just the brother, but Christ. And that's something important to understand. How do we do so? Well, first of all sins are violation of God's law. but also we've destroyed the one, verse 11, through whom Christ died, and thus sinned against Christ. Now, verse 13. Let's see what it says, and then we'll talk about some controversy around it, because it's a misused, not controversy, but it's a misused verse, so we want to hit it. Verse 13. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Now, this is going to set up chapter 9. Chapter 9, I already mentioned earlier, is about Paul being one who has denied himself liberties. And so what Paul says in verse 13 is, if food makes my brother to stumble, then what's the solution? Don't eat what... abstain from it. Don't eat what makes him stumble. Now it seems though, and we'll talk more about this Lord willing when we get into chapter 9, that some of them perhaps have the attitude, and again, I've said this before, Paul sometimes will answer something before it becomes an issue, that chapter 9 is Paul saying, now, unless you think that, really, Paul, would you really do that? Let me give you some examples to prove that such is the case. And then he gives in chapter 10 the example of Israel. Now, verse 13. Here's the misuse of the passage. Again, it's an often abused and misused passage, and it has to do with the rendering in the King James Version. In the King James Version here, in verse number 13, it says, wherefore, if meat makes my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh with the world while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. And so some have taken and sort of run with this and say, you shouldn't do anything that offends. And so they take and they apply that to anything. Because you tell me that I'm wrong, you know what that does? That offends me. And so some have sort of taken this to run with it and say, well, you see, you correct me when I'm in sin, now that offends me. You tell me I'm wrong, that offends me. And some have sort of taken and run with it. Let's hit a couple of things. The word rendered offend, according to BDAC, the Greek word rendered offend means to cause, to be brought to downfall. So we're not talking about my feelings were hurt. We're talking this word rendered offend in the King James, or stumble in others, means to be brought to a downfall. So that's important in understanding the word here is it's used, the meaning of the word, to bring to a downfall. It's talking about what makes one sin. By your actions, you have caused your brother to sin, or as the ESV renders it, you've caused him to stumble. Right? And so that's what we're talking about. You've caused him to sin. Let me give this. Sometimes when we look at questions or misuse of passages, something I think we need to consider is not just the far reach of that, the far ramifications of that.
Jesus told the Jews, you have your father the devil. John the Baptist called him a brood of vipers. So Jesus would have sinned, John the Baptist would have been sinning. If I'm sure they were offended if they say you're a descendant of a snake, that's not flattering. So, I mean, that just kind of comes into my mind that Jesus didn't sin. So by him telling the way it was, you of your father the devil, if it meant you couldn't offend Micah, then Jesus couldn't have made that statement.
Right. Now, here's what I said. We look at the far-reaching ramifications of it. So sometimes we consider something and we say, now, if this is true, that means, and here's how far out that goes. So let's take this. If this passage is literally saying, you can never do anything that hurts somebody's feelings or may make them offended, and I mean anything, you tell them they're wrong. I'm not talking about you do something you shouldn't do. I'm talking about you correct them and they say, well, I'm offended by that. You do anything that offends, that means here's the far-reaching consequence. You can't even preach the gospel. Go look at Acts chapter 4. Some were offended by what was said. You tell me you read Acts 4 that that's not somebody being offended or getting their feelings hurt. That's exactly what happened in Acts 4. And they continue to preach the gospel. That's the far-reaching consequences. If this offense means literally anything that might upset somebody. Rather, it's that which brings them to a downfall. Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 9. Again, the outline's not out, but I'll try to have that out for you Sunday morning for chapter 9.